Now, live from Whitney Media, 1460 WVOX, the Greenburgh Report with Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner. You can join in the conversation at 914-636-0110. Now on 1460 WVOX, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, my name's Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and today we have a very interesting program. A while back, I had interviewed Charles Copeland, who is one of the region's most preeminent experts in innovative engineering. Charles Copeland has created extraordinary legacies of engineering and was also involved in the Grand Central Terminal. He is also going to be talking to us about some innovations, how we can make our communities more sustainable through geothermal. So, Charles, thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you.
Could you maybe just tell us, maybe just to begin the program, with some of the career highlights? You've had many over the years, and maybe you could just share some of them with the community.
Sure. Well, you know, we worked for many of the New York's largest landlords, like Vornado, which is the largest, and SL Green and so forth. But over the years, by the way, currently we work on the Empire State Building. We spent 15 years working on Grand Central, redoing the infrastructure there. For example, air conditioning the main concourse, which was never air conditioned before. And also, by the way, addressing COVID with better filtration and throughout the terminal. We're currently working on many museums. I've been working on the Morgan Library, for example, for a number of years. The Guggenheim, Botanical Gardens, for example, we're studying now. And many, many landmark buildings. Currently, things like the St. James Episcopal Church, which is the landmark, Congregation Bethel Elohim, Central Presbyterian, First Presbyterian, many theaters, many museums, as I mentioned, like the Museum of the American Indian also. We did the St. James Theater a couple of years ago, which had the Disney production Frozen in it. Many, many hospitals in New York. We're doing a number of them in New Jersey. So that's kind of just a quick overview. I would like to talk about our concerns with energy at some point, and that's
what we're going to be spending most of the program, on that. I just had another question because there'll be a break in a few minutes. The difference between an engineer and an architect. How do you work with architects?
Sure. A lot of our projects, like Grand Central and many of these other buildings I've mentioned, we do as the prime because they're largely infrastructure, and we engage architects to help us. For example, we just did the Dance Theater of Harlem, and, it's largely infrastructure job, but we had architecture, and we engaged architects for it. Normally, it's the other way around, especially with a new building. It's usually the architect who's the prime, and they engage all the other parts of the team, the structural engineers, the infrastructure engineers, which we are, mechanical, electrical, and others. So architects are generally, they're concerned with a lot of the building, but they're mostly concerned with how it looks, how it lays out, how it accommodates the folks that are going to use the building, and et cetera. And then they leave it up to us engineers to make sure the building works either structurally or from an infrastructure perspective or from a life safety perspective, et cetera. So that's kind of the difference.
Great. You are also worried about climate change, and what has been some of your experiences dealing with climate change issues?
One of the reasons I left my first job was not enough concern for being more energy efficient. And then
so we have to take a break now. This is
Sure.
about a 5-minute break, and right after, let's spend the rest of the program talking about climate change and geothermal and some of the initiatives you're working on.
Sure.
So we'll be back in 5 minutes. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor with Charles Copeland, one of the top leaders in innovative engineering.
Back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning. I'm Paul Feiner. I'm Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and we have a really interesting program. My guest is Charles Copeland, who has an extraordinary career of engineering, and he's also very innovative and believes that we have to do more in terms of addressing climate change. So right before the break, we were touching on climate change and the importance of addressing this. And could you tell us a little bit about what you and your company have been doing?
Sure. So from the early days of our company, one of the projects I'm sort of proud of is working on an early solar collector installation, which eventually the folks in the building installed a windmill, which wound up changing the law throughout the country about tapping into and putting electricity back into the grid. So that one I did for a building on the Lower East Side, back when the Lower East Side was a place that most people didn't want to go near. It had old cars up on sidewalks and abandoned things all over the place. Then I was fortunate to be awarded the largest energy project for a city in the country, and that was from New York in the 1980s. So we did lots of interesting things to reduce energy use, which I won't go into a great deal of detail on, but they were fun. Did one of the first studies for the VA hospital system, and I'd say now, from an energy perspective, the most important thing I'm working on, and perhaps the most important thing for the New York area, is this law called Local Law 97, which is the most restrictive law on carbon emissions in the country, and assesses significant fines on all buildings greater than 25,000 square feet. So it's what happens is, if you don't address it and you're over the limit, eventually you will pay very significant fines. And some of them we've seen could actually be over $1 million a year for some buildings, a large building that doesn't deal with climate change, carbon emissions. So these are some of the things we're doing. But what I'm excited about is that Westchester, we've worked with Westchester now to come out with a tool, much like the tool we created for New York City, which looks at the feasibility of geothermal. And this tool is available and just came out, and we'll talk to you about some of the people involved and so forth. But if you have any questions, Paul, go ahead first.
Yeah, could you maybe just tell us a little bit about this exciting geothermal initiative, and is this available to the general public or only, government or key businesses?
Okay, so both the tool we created for New York City, which covers almost 900,000 lots, and the tool we created here for Westchester, which is, I believe, around 270,000 lots, is something called, if you can go online and download it. It's very easy to use. It's free. It's at www.geopossibilities.newyork.gov. And I'm sure you'll send that around later, Paul. But that allows you to just simply put in your address, any address in Westchester, and it will give you an idea of whether it's possible to use geothermal on your site. Now, it can be a residence, it can be a commercial building, a hospital, or a future building that you want to build on it. What's the relationship of the site and so forth. We always advise folks that this is a preliminary tool just to give you an idea, and it doesn't recognize every feature of your property, perhaps. And so we always recommend before you go to the next step of having a more detailed study done on your property. But it is available, and it's easy to use, and anybody who can use a computer can simply click on this tool and look at their property, put the address in, and it'll come up.
That is, that is great. We probably in 2007, the town built a new library, and we used geothermal, but it didn't work, that great. So they had to purchase another system that would complement the geothermal. Does geothermal, what are some of the problems with geothermal, and has the technology changed? So if, Greenburgh would have used geothermal now, would it have had a better chance of being much more successful than back in 2007?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of unfortunate installations that didn't quite make it. But what I like to encourage is the idea of using, let's say, a hybrid system, so that if you have, let's say, a significant amount of cooling and you're rejecting a lot of heat to the ground, as I've seen in a lot of cases, and the ground gets overly heated, that you use a device like a cooling tower to reject heat in the middle of the summer. But most of the year, or you can even use the device, a heat pump, an air heat pump to supplement it in the winter. But typically, you have to do your homework. And I think, unfortunately, over the past 4 or 5 years, there hasn't been enough engineering into looking into this.
We have to take another break, and then we'll be back in a couple minutes. I'm Paul Feiner with Charles Copeland. We're talking about geothermal and sustainability and his experiences as an engineer. I'm Paul Feiner.
WVOX. Now back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and my guest is Charles Copeland, and we're talking about geothermal. We're talking about engineering, about climate change, and we were talking about a contract that an initiative that he's been working on with Westchester County that would make it easier for people to decide whether or not it makes sense to use geothermal on their own homes or businesses. Could you just maybe, for people who are not aware of geothermal, like in as simple as possible, explain what geothermal is and what the savings could be?
Sure. We're trying, as a country and as New York State in particular, to move away as much as we can from using fossil fuels. And hopefully, as time goes by, we're still generating substantial portions of our electricity using fossil fuels, obviously, remotely. But hopefully over time, in a short time, we can start to use more friendly alternatives like wind and solar, and we use a lot of hydro already, but those kinds of alternatives to reduce our use of fossil fuels. So that's the reason we are looking at geothermal. The advantage of geothermal over, let's say, an air source heat pump is that the ground typically is one temperature around 50 degrees, so we can reject heat to it in the summer. We can collect heat from it in the winter through a heat pump, and it's very, very efficient. It can be close to 600% efficient compared to other means. Even air is reasonably efficient, but not the same as a consistent ground source. I do want to say that this whole program, which is very important, was funded by an organization of New York State called NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research and Development Administration. They funded it. They brought several folks into it, including us, because we did the New York City one. But they also brought some folks that were doing this from upstate New York. And Sustainable Westchester was involved in helping us promote this, and also the Westchester County Association. And geothermal basically works by, typically there are pipes in the ground. They're 4 to 5 feet deep, or we use wells or vertical shafts. In some cases, in particular in New York City where there's a lot of rock. And we use the ground as this resource. And it has to be done well. It has to be engineered well. Unfortunately, in the past, a lot of times it was done by, perhaps people who had some vested interest in working on it, contractors or whatever. So it does have to be done carefully, and which is why we, of course, say when you go online, you try it out. If you're going to go down that path, you get some experts in. They don't have to be engineers, but they have to be folks that are pretty careful about, their knowledge of geothermal, and they're responsible. So that's kind of the way it works.
A lot of people are installing solar on their homes, and that's become popular and sort of accepted. You see them all over. Do you think geothermal will spread all over Westchester? Will a lot of homeowners start using geothermal on their retrofit their properties? And is this very expensive?
Yeah, those are good questions. Look, the challenge is, my house here in Hastings, I live on a pretty small piece of property, and I have an old steam system that works pretty well. For me to put in geothermal would be converting the entire system, quite costly, probably in the near future, not in the cards for me. But if you're renovating a house like some folks I know, they're going to expand their house, and they're going to remove a lot of their systems. They have a nice, large backyard. That would be an opportunity to consider geothermal. It's clearly somewhat expensive, but the savings often pay back. In fact, if you go on the tool, it gives you an idea of when the savings pay back. Obviously, they're not going to pay back in a year or two, but they will eventually pay back, and as fossil fuels keep increasing in cost, they'll pay back even faster. So for a large number of older homes, like mine's a 1931, 32 house, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. But newer homes and people making renovations, I think they will definitely find it interesting to look up the feasibility of geothermal. And one advantage is on some of the options is you're getting both heating and cooling out of the same system. So in some cases not as expensive as you might think initially, because you are getting both heating and cooling off the same system. So
would it make sense for a community like Greenburgh to say pass a law that would say require the exploration of geothermal? So I'm thinking of, we have an old country club, and there's going to be housing both there. Probably in the neighborhood, at least 120, 119 units of housing. Would it make sense for the developer, as a condition of approval, to at least look at geothermal?
Yeah, I mean, I can't get too much into the issue of how the politics would work. Clearly, you don't have something that's a negative perspective to people to do these things, but if you can give some sort of incentive or even just a requirement that they at least have to look at it and give the town a report on it, I think that's a very reasonable thing to do, and perfectly acceptable in my view.
Right. I'm thinking also, there's major companies where we have Regeneron and Greenburgh, and they're doing a very significant, expansion. And everybody wants to be green, so this is something that could be looked at. One of the other issues that I was thinking of is you've had a lot of experience upgrading old buildings, Grand Central, and buildings throughout the world. I think you did Did you do also the Waldorf Astoria? The question that I had is, how do you upgrade old buildings without impacting their integrity?
Yeah, I mean, geothermal, and it's not too likely in many buildings, because in New York City, because of the height of the building versus the amount of land. But if you have a building that is feasible, you can certainly do it in many different ways. We did the Alexander Hamilton Customs House, and in some of these buildings we use the old duct systems if we can. We clean them and we fix them up and we insulate them and all that. But you can use that old duct for heat.
Right. We have to take one final break, and we'll be right back with Charles Copeland, and we're talking about sustainability, green initiatives, and geothermal. And I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor.
Now, back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning. I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor. And we're talking with Charles Copeland. And he is an engineer who is focusing a lot of attention on sustainability and green initiatives. And could you, for people who are just tuning in, give the app if people want to determine whether or not geothermal makes sense for their properties?
Sure. It's www.geopossibilities.newyork, and that's NY.gov. So www.geopossibilities.ny.gov.
And we were mentioning, the costs could be, significant, but at the same time, it pays off over time. So I guess if somebody's building a large commercial building and they expect that they're going to stay there for a number of years, it really makes sense. If somebody may be moving 5 years from now or whatever, then the payoff probably wouldn't be as great. How long does it usually take for people to benefit from the initiative?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing if you're building a new building, it's probably quite more immediate. When I mean immediate, I mean you could, within a few years, it could be. You may not even have to change that much to make the distinction, but it probably a few years. But as a practical matter for, let's say, a house or a residence, you're talking, if you're going to remove the old system, replace it, you're talking, 15, 16 years maybe in some cases, or a little less to get it to completely pay off. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen with the prices of fossil fuels and all that, so we don't know, exactly the time frame. But it's not going to be a few years. It's going to be a time. It makes sense certainly for newer buildings, a new building,
right?
And if you're changing your old building, for example, putting in these little multi-split units. These days, if you insulate a building well, you don't necessarily need to put radiators back at the perimeter. That was an old design when we didn't have much insulation in buildings on the walls. So, we wanted the heat to come near the wall and so forth. We kind of don't need to do that anymore. If we're properly insulated, we can do the heating overhead and discharge down. And that heating can be also done with cooling. So, with these small units that fit in the ceiling or an air system, either way. So with a big renovation to your house or a new house, et cetera, I think it makes an enormous amount of sense to do it, to consider it.
And are there any grants? I know there's been grants for solar installations. Is the same thing available for geothermal?
Yeah, I believe there are some grants from Con Edison and some other folks. I haven't looked in it too much, but I believe there are grants, and maybe even from New York State. So it's definitely worth accessing that. And, if I talk to my team, maybe we'll come up with some of them. We can send them to you.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that one initiative that people could look at is a hybrid system in which some portions of the heating and cooling requirements would be addressed through a conventional system combined with a ground source energy heat pump.
Yeah. With either a conventional or an air-to-air heat pump, let's say, if it's an office building, I would consider a little cooling tower to reject the heat. Usually an office building has more of an impact on the underground environment because of cooling than heating. Perhaps a house, for example, would extract more heat out of the ground in the winter, but an office building would reject more heat. So having a small cooling tower or something just to offset some of the excess heat into the ground is probably a good option. And generally, all of that's using electricity rather than fossil fuels, so it makes a lot of sense.
Right. We've talked about solar, we've talked about geothermal, and with the growing need to reduce carbon emissions from communities and facilities, are there other options besides those two that you've also worked on?
Yeah, I mean, we work on a lot of air-to-air heat pumps, clever ways to redistribute energy throughout a building. I'll give you an example. A lot of large, in particular New York City apartment houses, let's say more of the higher end ones, use a loop, a water loop, a secondary water loop that transfers, let's say, people on the south side that are getting a lot of sun, they're rejecting heat to the loop. And people on the north side that aren't getting any sun that need heating, they're extracting the heat from the loop. And the good news about that is everybody is responsible for how they operate the system. So they have an incentive not to, leave it running because they have they get separate bills. So that's a clever way of redistributing the energy one way or the other throughout a building so that, we're using the same, we're not rejecting heat and then trying to restore heat through fossil fuel where we're looping it in the building and some part of it is rejecting the heat, that another part of it is collecting the heat. So that's a clever thing to do as well. I'm sure there's many others, but those are just a few.
Right. Another question I have is, New York are we behind, say, Europe? Is Europe more, active in terms of having green buildings than New York and the United States?
Well, yeah, certainly the United States. A lot of Europe is way ahead. They're doing some interesting things with some of the technologies. I've had folks in my office that explain some of the interesting things with devices like induction units, which have been around for 50 years and can be used to be very efficient. So Europe is more on the cutting edge. As a matter of fact, the folks we use to help with our tool came from Holland, so the Netherlands, because they do a lot of studies on how to use geothermal and so forth on little small pieces of land throughout there. So Europe is way ahead of us. New York and probably California are the most cutting edge when it comes to trying to address this very, very important thing. This is going to affect our children and grandchildren, and something that I think about a lot. It makes me kind of sad that we're not doing more to address it. So, yes, Europe is a little ahead of us, that's for sure.
Right. We're running out of time. Do you have a website for your company?
Sure. Just go to goldmancopeland.com. And, you'll see our website and the kind of work we do.
Great. Well, thanks so much. You do a lot of great things, and I'm really thrilled that you're part of our community. You live in Hastings, so thank you so much. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor.
Thank you.
Thank you.